All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Wellness Wednesday, Self-Expression and Creation for Brain Health. My name is Cheyenne Head, and I'm a research assistant with the BC Brain Wellness Program, and I will be serving as your MC for today's event. We are joined today by two very special guests who will be sharing how creative modalities, such as art, can be beneficial for your brain. Dr. Lara Boyd will speak about art and brain health. Are they linked? And then Mady Mooney will share a talk and run through a practical exercise on creating art for health. Before we get started, I'd first like to acknowledge that the BC Brain Wellness Program at the Javad Moafagian Center for Brain Health is situated on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. I'm joining you today from Vancouver, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As all of you are joining from different places today, I encourage us all to take a moment to reflect and give thanks to the lands where we are privileged to work, learn, and play. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. If you have any questions for any of our presenters today, please type them in the chat box and we'll answer them towards the end of the session. As well, the session is being recorded and the recording will be available to you on the website at bcbrainwellness.ca in about 2 weeks' time if you'd like to rewatch or share with your friends and family. Without further ado, I will introduce our first guest, Dr. Boyd. Dr. Boyd is a physical therapist and neuroscience at the University of British Columbia, where she is a professor and Wall Scholar. She is an expert in neurobiology of learning and uses advanced brain imaging approaches to look into the brain. Dr. Boyd's research is centered on understanding how behavior shapes learning, unlearning, and relearning. She has published more than 180 scientific papers, and her TEDx talk, "After This, Your Brain Will Not Be the Same," has over 30 million views. The floor is all yours, Dr. Boyd.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm here. You're joining me from my home office in East Vancouver, so I hope wherever you are, you're able to get out and enjoy this mostly beautiful day we're having today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know about art and brain health at this time, and then tell you just a smidgen about some of the work we're doing at UBC to try to pursue these questions. So before I forget, if you have any questions for me later on, you think of something down the line, you're very welcome to send me an email, and my email address is there on the first screen. I'm pretty easy to find if you type in my name. Oops, here we go. Okay, so I just want to start by making the point that art and the creation of art seems to be a fundamental and very important thing for humans. So we have evidence of early art that goes back maybe as long as 50,000 years before the present. I mean, that's pretty incredible in the historic record. And so this is a cave painting of an animal in Indonesia that's been dated to be between 40,000 and 50,000 years old. And so this need or desire and the importance of art is not just limited to the visual arts, which would be shown in this illustration, but they're also very ancient examples of the need to create music. So there are old musical instruments. For example, the Israeli flute, which was found in France, is at least 20,000 years old, perhaps as old as 35,000, as well as there's a series of flutes that were found in the Henan province in China that we're fairly confident are 7,000 to 9,000 years old, and these can actually still be played. So here's a recording.
I don't think we can hear Dr. Boyd.
Oh no, that's terrible. I wonder why not. I'm not sure what to do about it. Okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. You can Google search those and you can hear them. And I'm sorry, it was playing a lovely tune and I was going to let it finish. But thank you for letting me know. So my point though is that there seems to be something, incredibly important about art to humans. And something that I've wondered quite a bit about is, why? But I do think that the persistence of the arts, whether they be visual art or literary arts or musical arts, seems to suggest some kind of intrinsic value across all cultures. So I have a hypothesis I've been playing with a bit for the past few years, and that is that there's something about the arts, and specifically I've been studying music, that must have a value to humans, and that's why we do it. That's why it feels good. And so what I've wondered is there something about engagement with music specifically that would positively affect our brain health? So I'm going to show you some evidence to suggest that music impacts our brains in many ways. It changes our brain function, structure, and the basic levels of excitability in our brain. And then my idea is that perhaps there's something about the engagement of music that is affecting our neurobiology. So it's an interesting and it's kind of difficult field to study because the fields of neurobiology and artistic expression are not traditionally linked. Very few people do research in this area. And so what we've been trying to do is try to understand how we could better connect and understand these two domains. So we have interesting evidence out there already. And so I'll talk a little bit about how music impacts behavior, brain, and health. And then I'll tell you a little bit about some ongoing work at UBC, which we call the Wall Opera Project. So, how do we think that music or art are impacting, our behavior? So there's these really interesting research that comes out of a survey called America for the Arts, or Americans for the Arts, that shows that just exposing students to arts in the school actually alters their behavior. So students who are able to engage with the arts are much more less likely to drop out of school. And what's really interesting about this effect is that it seems to have a stronger effect even amongst students who have very low socioeconomic status. So you might think, well, kids that have engagement with the arts may come from higher income homes, and so they'd be less likely to drop out of school anyway. And that probably is true. But even if you're from a very low socioeconomic environment, if you're able to engage with the arts, you're much more likely to stay in school. So these are dropout rates. This is data from 2008, so pre-pandemic, and we don't know how the pandemic may have changed this. But, but you see that students who have low arts involvement and come from a low socioeconomic background have about a 22% chance of dropping out of secondary school, where students involved in the arts have a 4% chance. That's a very significant difference. We also see links between art and education. So we see people who are more engaged with the arts, first of all, tend to do better on science test scores. So this is what we call a transfer effect from the arts. And again, if you look specifically at kids who are coming from a lower socioeconomic status background, we find that kids, it's about a 7-point improvement on science test scores from just being highly involved in the arts versus less involved. And you find that students who are involved in the arts are more likely to go on to enroll in a bachelor's degree program, so more likely to pursue post-secondary education. And this is a pretty big jump here, where you see students with low socioeconomic status with no arts involvement. About 19% of those kids will go on to secondary education, post-secondary degrees. And you see 32% of kids from the same background who have high involvement in the arts. So there's something about this engagement that's shaping behavior, that's changing maybe outlook on future if you're thinking about students who are then going to go on and want to pursue a higher degree. So how do you knit kind of those behaviors that we see, these kind of very sociological behaviors, with the kind of research that I do? So I'm going to kind of step back for a moment. Excuse me. My research is focused on how behaviors and environments actually affect the brain, specifically brain health and learning. And the field of neuroscience in the last 20 years has undergone a huge transformation. And that was catalyzed by our discovery that the brain is highly dynamic and it's rapidly changing all the time. Forgive me, it's a bad time to have a tickle in your throat. So we now know that the brain is rapidly changing its structure and physiology, and it does this in support of learning. And this process is what we call neuroplasticity. Excuse me. Okay, so I want to talk just really quickly about what is neuroplasticity and what drives these changes in the brain. So we know now that when we learn something new, we change our brain chemistry, we change our brain structure, we change our brain function, and that these processes aren't happening independently, that they're all happening together, they're supporting one another and circling back on one another. So one of the first things that happens when we learn something new is we rapidly change the chemical signaling in our brain. So I have here a very pretty photograph of actual brain cells, which are called neurons. And here's one, for example, this is the body of the neuron. And you see this long process going out. That's its axon, or kind of a long wire from it projecting to another neuron someplace else. The way that these neurons interact with one another, and here's kind of a group of them, is by sending little packets of chemistry, of chemical signals called neurotransmitters that pass from one to another. So the neurons don't actually physically touch one another when they transfer information or transfer excitability between one another. They're actually sending these chemicals, and these chemicals can either increase or decrease the excitability of adjacent neurons. So this is pretty cool because what it allows us to do is to see that these concentrations of neurotransmitters, these chemicals, can change very quickly in the brain to support new learning. And this is what we think is the foundation of what we call short-term memories. So for something to actually be remembered and learned, you actually have to change that short-term memory into a long-term memory. So we all know this feeling of only having made a short-term memory. I tease my students at UBC about cramming for exams. That's forming a short-term memory for the material in the course, but you're not actually learning anything. You probably forget it right after you take the exam. You may do well on the exam, but you won't actually have learned anything. So in order to form a long-term memory, we actually have to change our brain's structure. And that actually means changing the way these neurons are attaching or connecting with one another in the brain. These long kind of processes coming off from the neurons are called dendrites. I think of them as like branches of a tree. And you can add or remove these dendrites in the brain, and that will change brain structure. That change in brain structure is what supports longer term memories. That takes time, it probably takes sleep. But that's kind of in order to learn something. So for example, in order to learn to play the piano, which is a huge, really lifelong task, you'll have to very significantly not change just your brain structure, but also, not change just your brain chemistry in the short term, but actually your brain structure in the longer term. Together, those two changes enable changes in brain function. So then your different brain regions can activate with different intensities and at different timings to support change in other areas. So when you put that all together, that's what we're talking about. We talk about neuroplasticity, is we're mapping change at one of these levels in the brain. We can do this in humans using magnetic resonance imaging, for example, and that's some of the research that I'll show you here in a moment. We can also do it by mapping brain excitability, mapping patterns of brain activity as well. And so I just want to impress upon you two really important things is I'll jump to the important part of this talk. Music changes all three of these things. And the other really important part of this talk is these processes of being neuroplastic in order to enable learning, they happen throughout our lifespan. So there are periods of time where we might be more neuroplastic than others. Childhood is one of those. We're learning a lot of things really quickly, but we're still very, very capable of neuroplasticity well into old age. And we're capable of learning new things regardless of having brain damage, having a disease in our brain, a disease that affects our brain, or by whether we're young, middle-aged, or old. So one thing that we find then, when we start now to think about the direct effect of music on the brain, is that just like extensive practice of any other motor movement skill, extensive piano practice alters the structure of the brain. So there are MRI or magnetic resonance imaging approaches where we can actually look at the thickness of what we call white matter tracts in the brain. Those are those long projecting axons or long projecting branches from the neurons themselves. And these are better or less able to conduct impulses. We can measure this by looking at how water molecules move along those axons in the brain. And so we find that extensive piano practice is actually related to the amount of thickness or the, if you will, capability to conduct an impulse of different white matter brain regions. So we find a relationship between a measurement, it's called fractional anisotropy, just a measurement of the integrity of these brain tracts and the numbers of total hours practiced of piano in childhood. See this very nice linear relationship between tract integrity and practice hours. And so this is pretty compelling evidence of the effect of practice. Now, I can tell you that if you practice something else, a golf swing or keyboarding, another motor task, you also see these relationships, these same kinds of relationships between brain structure and the amount of practice that's out there. And so this is not super surprising, but it gives us some insight into the effect of musical instrumental practice on the brain. So we also see that musical training enhances neuroplasticity, and that it might even enhance our capacity for neuroplasticity. So it might actually be able to make us a better learner if we're actually trained in music. And so this is a really neat study. It was done by Holtz, is the lead author's name. And they were looking at long-term piano training. And so they measured this in a number of different ways. So firstly, they looked at whether or not long-term piano training actually would change how good people were at being able to encode or learn new patterns of sound. And so as compared to non-musicians, musicians are much faster and better able to learn new sound regularities, so auditory regularities. And you actually see change in the auditory and the hearing part of the brain that supports this increased capacity for learning new regularities in sound. In the same experiment, they also found, and I think this is really interesting, that this long-term training actually affected musicians' ability to discriminate different sensations with their hands. So it wasn't just that they were better at hearing because they practiced hearing piano all the time. You see increased capacity for neuroplasticity across the whole brain. And this is even manifested in the fact that they were more sensitive with their fingertips in terms of a touch in the musicians as compared to the non-musicians. So the sensory system has changed. And then lastly, oops, forgive me, now I've gone the wrong way. Lastly, in another experiment that looks at the excitability of the motor regions of the brain, we find that musicians have a better capability for motor system plasticity. So that suggests they would be better learners of new movements as compared to non-musicians. And so you see this kind of whole-scale enhancement across many different brain regions in people who do this type of training. I want to shift a little and talk more about health because that's the focus of the talk and what I'm more interested in my research. And so there's some suggestions that musical training actually is what we call neuroprotective as we age, or that is that it helps us to avoid diseases of the brain, avoid damage in the brain, and perhaps recover better after those processes, after the brain is damaged or diseased. And so if you compare musicians with non-musicians, you find that even in older individuals, the individuals with musical background are better at learning new sounds, so learning information that's conveyed verbally, like we're doing right now. They're better at distinguishing noise from speech, so they can tune their auditory cortex so that they can hear things better. So imagine being in a big, busy restaurant, it's very loud, and you're trying just to listen to the person across the table from you. musicians are much better at this tuning as they age. And they have better working memory for things that they're hearing said out loud. So if you're dictating a list of items or you're actually listening to a lecture and you want to actually remember that information later on, those musicians will have a significantly enhanced capacity to form a new memory based on a language or a verbal event. And then we find that there's a positive effect of music on recovery from stroke. And so I study stroke, and so these data are particularly interesting to me. And so in this particular experiment, it's really interesting. They compared a group that listened to music each day, a group that listened to an audiobook, and then a control group that didn't get to listen. And so you see that from baseline to 6 months of these interventions, the music group is in blue, the auditory book is in red, and green is the control group. So you find the group that listened to music 1 hour a day for the first 2 months after stroke, you see a significant improvement while they're listening to music. But what's really neat is, so the intervention ended here after 2 months. So at 3 and 6 months, the benefit to verbal memory, to making new memories, persists in the music listening group, which is really remarkable. And it's very significantly improved above and beyond the other two groups. You see similar effects for focusing attention. You see significantly less depression in the group that listened to music. And you see significantly less confusion in the group that listened to music. So those are some pretty impactful outcomes in general. And it just simply, the intervention is you listen to music for 1 hour a day. So that's something I think our healthcare system can accommodate. It's a pretty easy thing to accomplish. We also see that musical participation can help to preserve function in people who have Alzheimer's disease. So in people who are suffering from dementia. And so this is now a 10-week program of singing, listening to music, or just usual care. And so what we find is that the group who either sings or listens to music, they showed less decline in function as compared to just usual care. The usual care group is in black. So you see that general cognition is preserved by singing or listening to music. Being more oriented to place and time is preserved by singing or listening to music. And then short-term working memory is also preserved by listening to music. And what's terrible for the people in this study, but an important experimental control, is that the follow-up when these interventions were taken away, so people no longer were in a singing group or had a structured program of listening to music, you see that those benefits, those preservations, for example, of general cognition are lost and they decline. Same for orientation and the same for memory. So this suggests that a musical intervention should be just a routine part of care for people who are suffering from dementia. So a person like me looks at data like that. It's really exciting. It's really cool. And I think, but why? What is going on? Why is music affecting the brain that way? So there's a number of ideas and hypotheses being tested. One is that one of the things music does is it just increases blood flow to the brain. You see this increased excitability in the brain, you see increased blood flow, and blood flow brings along with it something called brain growth factors. So growth factors are chemical factors that help the brain to be more neuroplastic. Well, that's probably one thing that's happening. That's tied into a different cardiovascular response, and that happens there. The other thing that is probably happening is that music is changing the way we regulate our stress hormone. And other studies have shown that the net effect of listening to or performing music is that it decreases cortisol, and cortisol is our stress hormone. So cortisol is a hormone that's secreted by the adrenal glands, and it's actually quite important for our bodies. So we all woke up this morning because our cortisol levels went up. They either went up because you woke up on your own, or they went up because your alarm went off and it scared you and you jumped up. and that also spiked your cortisol. But so cortisol is important for arousal. It helps regulate sugars and blood pressure. It helps regulate our immune function, inflammation, and it can positively affect memory. So, that kind of you're a little bit excited, you're a little bit on edge because you're going to maybe take a test, maybe you're going to run a race. That's cortisol. So it has some positive effects. The problem is that when cortisol is really high, because we're really stressed for a very long time, it can have very negative effects on our body and on our brain. And this is the situation of chronic stress. And so, as an aside kind of point, this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently because I feel like the entire world has been under 2 years of just unrelenting chronic stress and anxiety. And I think it's showing in rates of anxiety, for example, in young people and just amongst everyone at the moment. And this is also a cortisol effect. So high cortisol for a long time can lead to blood sugar imbalances, can decrease your bone density and muscle mass, can lower your immunity, it increases abdominal fat, and it can also actually change your cholesterol. So you're expressing more bad cholesterol as compared to good cholesterol. And worst is cortisol, high levels of cortisol can impair your cognitive performance. It actually can prevent us from being able to learn. And I think we all know that feeling. You're so stressed, you're so anxious, you can't think, you can't remember. That's cortisol. That's too much cortisol. So we think about cortisol as being kind of this inverted U, where you can have too little and you're very lowly motivated, low arousal. You have too much, you're really anxious, you can't think, and you kind of want to be right here in this sweet spot. So what we think music may help do is to pull us back into that sweet spot, that music is able to decrease high levels of cortisol, balance us out, and kind of move us back up this curve towards a balance in our cortisol. Most of us live over here with too much cortisol. So engagement with music, engagement with the arts, we think is changing brain structure and function, changing blood flow to the brain, allowing it to be more neuroplastic, decreasing cortisol, and increasing growth factors that we need for learning. So we think these are kind of the mechanisms that are going to allow music to directly and positively affect our brain health. So this is something we're actually trying to study at UBC, working on studying right now. And so I think some of you have heard us talk about this before, so I'll just be really brief. But we have a collaboration with Nancy Hermiston, who runs the opera program at UBC, and Janet Worker, who studies language development, and myself, who studies the brain in humans. And many years ago, actually now, Nancy Hermiston came to me and said that she thought she had the impression that engagement in the opera program at UBC actually made her students better learners. And there were instances where kids came into her program who had been diagnosed with a learning disability, and that learning disability subsequently went away with time and training. And so she really wanted to study this, and it sounded interesting, but I had no idea where you'd ever get money to study something like this. So this work eventually became sponsored by the Peter Wall Institute at UBC. And what it has enabled us to do is to actually test this idea, and that is that opera training will change learning, memory, and executive function, so higher level planning, and that it will change brain structure and function. So the pandemic did not help this study, but we're getting there. We've been working on it for several years now. And so what we're trying to do is understand when you engage in opera, it's not just music. It's actually becomes a lot more complicated than just music. So you also have singing, you have acting, you have dance, you have movement, and you're synthesizing these forms. And then on top of all that, as if that wasn't hard enough, the performers do this most often in a second language. There are a few English operas, but not a ton. And so they're often doing this in Italian or Polish or German or some other incredibly difficult language. And so you have this very high cognitive load. And so we're studying what's the combination of these factors. What is that doing actually to the brain? Is it giving us a healthy, better learning brain? And we already have data showing that it indeed is changing brain function and structure. So we've studied this a couple ways. We've looked at one month intensive opera training. We have a 1-year longitudinal study where we study students over a whole year of opera training. And we're looking at cognition, education, and their brains. This study had been planned to be done last year. We're now finishing up this year with our last cohort being tested in May and June. So we're actually going to have a really neat amount of data to tell you about in the fall, I hope. So I hope you'll invite us back and we can tell you more about what musical training in the form of opera is doing to your brain. So I just want to finish with this last thought, and I want us all to take just a moment and imagine what happens without the arts. So just even conservatively, the economic impact of combined arts, visual, literary, and musical arts in Canada is $50 billion a year. And I thought about this a lot during the pandemic lockdown. What were we all doing? Well, we were binge watching Netflix, we were doing theater. I read a lot, which was really kind of nice. And, music is constantly on in my house. So it was really kind of a balm for our souls. And I worry quite a bit that with all the closures, I don't know how artists made it through the last 2 years of not being able to perform. And so I just want to have us have a good think about, how can we help restore our local music and arts communities now that we can return to enjoying these things. I hope we all get the chance to do that very soon. I actually have tickets to a theater play in early June, and I ran past Bard on the beach the other day and almost cried with excitement to see them putting up the big tent. So it's coming back, but I do think we need to really think about how we help our performers and our artists, because I think we desperately need them, not just for our pleasure, but I think it's also really good for our brains. So with that last thought, I'll take questions. I'll thank my co-thinkers at the Peter Wall Institute, as well as the folks in my lab that are do this work. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. That was really fascinating. I loved hearing about what an impact that just listening to music can have on our brain. That was really interesting. We can do a couple of quick questions now, and then what we don't get to, we can answer at the end after Maddie's talk. So just one here. How does hearing loss affect brain health related to making or listening to music?
So hearing loss is very significantly associated with increased levels of dementia. So it's really important to get out in front of hearing loss as it starts to emerge. And it's something I worry about as all of us walk around with these things in our ears, which I'm just as bad as anyone else. I'm not throwing stones there. My daughters, I think they're going to grow into their ears. I have 16-year-old daughters, so they have their earbuds in all the time. But it is a really important key factor, and it then can limit your access to these brain health tools. So don't be like my dad, quite frankly. And I hope he is listening, and pretend you don't have anything wrong with your hearing when you actually need help. That's my warning.
Great, thank you. A next one here. The word plasticity gives me the impression of rigidity, not flexibility. Why is that used for the brain?
Oh, so it's plasticity in that it's moldable. But here's the key, it's moldable by whatever you do. So if you do nothing, it will be very rigid, it won't change. So it's the idea that really your behavior absolutely shapes the structure and function of your brain. And in doing so, it is plastic.
Great, thank you for that clarification. What if the listening group, who did not get music initially in the first several months post-morbid, had the intervention subsequently? Can they experience a period of recovery? And would it be equal to individuals who received the music initially?
It's a wonderful question. I'd love to know the answer. If I could guess, the group that listened, if they were able to be more engaged, later, you would see a benefit, but probably not as big. So one of the things we know about stroke is that early, you seem to have this heightened capacity for neuroplasticity. It doesn't go away, but it diminishes with time. And so it's really important to intervene as soon as you can. But if that changes, new approaches come out, you didn't get that care early, it will still have an effect later.
Great. Thank you. And I guess one question is how we can increase our participation or put some of these things into practice that we now know are quite beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the things the Brain Wellness Program is doing around music is one of the easy and exciting things to do. There's also some suggestion that doing these things in a social setting also confers an even larger benefit. So this is not my work. There's work from Laurel Trainer's group back east showing that you have this engagement where all of our brains will start to sync up their oscillatory patterns as we sit together in an audience watching a performer, which is a really interesting idea. And that then it confers these benefits out to the entire group. So that's one thing. But if you're not able to do that, just engaging with the music in whatever way you can. So I'm not musical. I would say I'm a patron. I love music, but I only sing in the shower and only if I think no one's listening or alone in my car, right? And I don't play an instrument. But that doesn't mean that I can't can take some benefit from music itself. Yeah, and so whatever level you're at, engage.
Perfect. Thank you. How would the age you start learning music affect the process?
So there is some data to suggest that you get a bigger benefit the earlier you start because you're just building this capacity for more neuroplasticity later. However, there's no strong relationship between your proficiency and that benefit. So my mom made me take piano lessons and I was terrible and I hated it and I got kind of mad at her for making me. I still get the benefit of suffering through those piano lessons now in my older age in terms of my brain health. So that was a nice thing she did for me. I should say thank you when I see her at Easter. So you can pick up these benefits later in life, and you don't have to be a piano master or a singing virtuoso in order to have the benefit. But it does seem to help if you start younger. A little more benefit doesn't mean there's not still one for starting later.
Perfect. There's hope for all of us.
There's hope for all of us.
And one last one before we move on to our next speaker. Does natural noises like birds, wind, waves also impact brain cortisol?
I don't know, but I have to think that they do, just because anything that's allowing you to take that stress level down, as many of those things will, are reducing your cortisol. And you can feel it. You can feel it when your cortisol is like you're able to like blow it out, right? And so my guess is yes, but I don't know of a research study. There's probably is one out there and I'm just unaware, but I don't know of one off the top of my head.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And if there are a few more questions, maybe we have some time at the end, we can revisit those. Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Next up, we have our very own Mady Mooney. Mady teaches the Art from the Heart classes at the BC Brain Wellness Program. She holds a master's degree in psychotherapy and spirituality with a specialization in art therapy. She conducted her research in chronic pain and art therapy in women diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. She is presently in private practice in Vancouver, where she sees clients who are exploring issues such as anxiety, stress, depression, life transitions, and abuse. She is primarily a client-centered therapist and as such believes that you have an innate wisdom and capacity for self-healing and personal growth. When she is not working, she enjoys being an artist. She loves painting and photography. Welcome, Mady.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Nice to have you here today, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to say a few words about the healing benefits of creating art, and for letting me take you through a short art exercise for which no artistic skills are needed. What is art for healing as we practice it in the Art from the Heart classes? It's a combination of making art and processing one's feelings. So the artistic process that occurs when we create intuitive art often connects us to our memories, our emotions and feelings, all with a potential healing benefit. So for instance, when we intuitively match these inner states with corresponding colors or brushstrokes or symbols, a stress relief may be noticed. And even if the states are challenging, for instance, if we feel sad and we really get into the feeling, we feel into that feeling and we look at the colors of, let's say, the paints in front of us, we might feel that this feels for us mauve or purple or blue. And then we use that in our painting So making art lets us use feelings such as this, for example. At the same time, when we feel sad, we can also feel lighter. And this is because studies show that making art stimulates a release of dopamine. And that's a chemical that's created when we do something that's pleasurable. And this way, art is kind of a way out of being stuck. It has an ability to move us from an emotion into motion. So it's beneficial to us to engage and to get our feelings, our memories to the surface and move them, right? So the benefits of healing art are relaxation. It can be stress relief. There can be an emotional release, self-discovery at times. When we are relaxed, our pain may be less. And it can also improve the quality of our life. And some days making art is just a great way to distract ourselves from all the things that are going on in our life and maybe the way the world is today. So you might say, who benefits from healing arts? Well, it's good for anyone at any age. And also for sure for people with neurological disorders, including Alzheimer's, MS, PD, stroke, and brain tumors. And also it's very good for care partners who can use the art either for themselves to feel what they're going through when they're looking after another person that they love, or they can do the art together with their person that they look after. And they can also use the art that they have created as a prompt for a discussion. So yeah, that way it's to our benefit to create these intuitive, abstract pieces of art. And so without too much talking, I would really like to take you through an exercise. And I would like you to maybe go back and think of how you felt. What was your last week like? And then grab onto a feeling of that week. And maybe close your eyes and feel this week, how it was for you. You may like to put your hand on your heart and sink into the feeling. And just take a few deep breaths. Now, with this feeling, imagine that you are a tree. What would you look like as a tree? For instance, what does your trunk look like? Do you have any foliage? Any flowers? Lots? Few? What is your environment like? Are you one tree by itself? Are you by the beach? In the forest? What's around you? And what is the weather like where you are? Is it raining? Does it feel warm and sunny? Do you notice a storm or wind? So with all these feelings that you have and all these visions that you have just brought in, I would like you to take a moment or a few moments to draw a tree. So draw yourself as this tree that you just imagined in your mind. And I hope you all have paper and a pencil or some markers or crayons. We can maybe leave this slide here. So if you wanted to remember what it was that you need to remember, then you can just have a look and read it. So I'm going to give you about, let me see, about 8 minutes, I think, to draw this tree. And then I'll get back to you. Because I'm looking at the slide, I really can't see who is finished with the drawing or who is not. But if you are, it's good practice to sit with it and look at it and maybe do some journaling about what it is that you see. Actually, you're probably looking at a mirror of what's happening in your life or what was happening during the last week, portrayed in the tree, of course. You could see if there are any surprises in the tree. Maybe you thought you'd have a tree full of flowers, but instead you end up with 3 leaves. And then you could sit with that and write a little bit about that. So see if there are any surprises in your drawing, or if something is, let's say, a lot smaller than you thought it would be, or a lot larger. If it's lacking color or not. And we usually, when we draw like this, we make no mistakes. When we come from our heart and we draw, we get what we're feeling. When we paint with our head, it's very different. We choose the colors and we can mistakes. But with this kind of abstract, intuitive drawing, it's usually about something truthful that comes up and it's expressed onto paper. And herein lies the healing part, because it's an opportunity for us to express our feelings without words, just in imagery. I think we're probably at the end of the time for the drawing. And maybe there's someone who has a question for me or about the painting. I think I have another minute. I can address that for you.
If anyone has any questions for Mady or would like to share anything about their experience, I think we can maybe take some questions now. Thank you so much. That was very wonderful. I liked really going back and thinking introspectively about, my week and what's going on in my life right now. That was really felt therapeutic. So I understand.
Good. Thank you.
Hi, Mady. This is Shireen. I come to your class, so I just enjoyed you taking us through what's happening now at the present moment. Always that's exciting to see. This is what comes out. For me, it was a magnolia tree in budding and beginning to bloom and in rain. And so I think in spite of what happens around you, you still are able to bloom. And even the people surrounding me are the blossoms too for me, I think. Lovely. And it uplifts you, and the breaking of the sun gives you hope. And on the earth, there is flowers beginning to sprout. So I think life is changing after pandemic. I think people are beginning to feel free. That's what
wonderful. Yeah, that's really great to hear. So that's sort of, you portray that in blossoming of
yes.
the tree. Nice. So that's hope, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. Lovely.
Dr. Questwall just, excuse me, had a comment here. So surprised by the difference it makes drawing from the heart rather than the rational analytical side of myself. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. It comes from two different places altogether, right? And you end up with a very different work of art. Both are good, but just different.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else has any questions for either of our presenters? I'm not sure if Dr. Boyd is still around, but we can take any final questions with the last couple minutes. Oh, she is here. So for either Mady or Dr. Boyd, I will stop sharing my screen. I think there was one question for Dr. Boyd that we didn't get to. Yeah, I think you briefly touched on this, but maybe we can revisit it, Dr. Boyd. Regarding participation, how can we as an individual increase brain power? Just listen to a type of music, going to a concert, solo singer, or group singer?
Yeah, so I think all of the above are great. There is some power in the social. I like to think about leveraging. So could you make it even better, even more powerful? And there are data to suggest that these things become even more powerful for our brains when we do them in social groups. So are you singing with a group, or are you participating with a group who's engaged with a performer or some kind of show? That may actually have a stronger benefit than listening on your own. But if you prefer listen on your own, and then certainly that's outstanding as well. I'll just mention as well that there are some other data from an unrelated field that suggests that these things are also very powerful in nature. So, maybe not listening to music, but maybe someone mentioned listening to natural sounds or listening to music while you're in a natural environment may also have a really strong benefit for your brain health.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, and again, I will plug our musical movements class, which is a group singing class. You learn a bit about rhythm and music theory, and you kind of get to enjoy music together. That's led by Cynthia Friesen. And again, our art class, which Mady Mooney leads, is very popular and kind of goes through a longer version of what we did today. And one last question for you, Mady. What do you mean by journaling our image? Can you please expand on that a little bit?
You can, for instance, you can take your image and you can use it as a prompt for even a meditation. And you sit with your image and you just let it speak to you. It's really nice to really listen to that. And then, if you like writing, you can write to your image, or you can ask your image a question. And if you listen well, it'll speak back to you. And then you can engage in a journaling exercise of some kind. It's really good to actually leave your image, hang it on the wall, and you walk by it during the day, and it'll speak to you. You'll pick up something, and you can write about that. So that takes you into a next level of, processing. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers, both you, Dr. Boyd and Mady, for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined. Unfortunately, I don't think that we can get to the last couple of questions, but thank you again for being here. I'd also like to highlight that today is UBC Giving Day, and the BC Brain Wellness Program was fortunate enough to be highlighted. So I think Matt will pop the link in the chat if you would like to visit our UBC Giving Day page. Thank you again to everyone. Again, if you would like to rewatch this, it will be posted on our YouTube channel in a couple weeks, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you all.